You're listening to the audio lecture for the sixth module of the Poli-Sci 437 course, International Security. In this module, we will be looking at multilateralism and integration and negotiation, three strategies of security cooperation that have become important and quite common as we move into the late 20th and early 20th centuries. One of the reasons why we focus on multilateralism and integration is because in some very important parts of the world, this is how security is understood now. It's not a rivalry between paranoid states constantly looking over their back. Security policy is done in a multilateral format, which means that states are constantly consulting with their neighbors and other states, usually within the auspices of an institution or organization, in order to calculate what their security interests are and what actions and policies should be taken. Sometimes this is done to maintain a balance of power, but in places like Europe, especially Western Europe, this is done because there's a general consensus now that security interests are more or less harmonized, and that security interests and security policies are made in consultation with fellow institution members. Again, Europe is a good example of this. It's one of the best examples of this. We're seeing in some cases with the European Union, although the last few years have been problematic, of states actually integrating their security apparatus together, which means that military forces increasingly work alongside the military forces of other states, that their officer corps are somewhat integrated. Crews of ships and submarines will serve on each other's vessels. That, at least in Europe, there is a movement towards seeking security in a genuinely cooperative format. Now, obviously, the first question that probably leaps into your mind is, well, given what we've learned in the previous modules, why on earth would states do this? And there are certain advantages when a sufficient trust is achieved to go about pursuing security policies on a multilateral basis. When you have these institutions and these regimes and these organizations take hold, they solve a lot of your security problems. They solve a lot of your problems with regard to trust and the willingness to be vulnerable to other states and other security policies. For example, we can talk about the notion of transaction costs. Institutions, regimes, and organizations reduce transaction costs. They make it easier to accomplish policy objectives. If you are a European country and you have to calculate your security vis-a-vis the security of 24 other countries, that's very taxing on your military apparatus and your foreign ministries. Whereas if all these countries are all part of a single organization and can consult with each other and communicate with each other and share policy objectives with each other, that's going to reduce the transaction costs and make everything very efficient. And once you have cooperation on one security issue, you create a feedback loop, which means that on different and more intense and deeper security issues, that cooperation will persist, and you'll be more willing to trust a state you've already trusted and already worked with on a previous security issue. So these feedback loops become very, very important. There's also a sense that security policy doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs within the context of other issues with regards to trade, with regards to cultural policies, with regards to refugee policy, and that you can cooperate or integrate these various policies together and be prepared to give concessions on one set of issues that may not be related to security directly, to win concessions on other sets of issues that may deal with security. This is called issue linkage. And if you can link issues together that may not necessarily be related, your chances of facilitating cooperation are much greater. Finally, you have the notion of diffuse reciprocity. This is the idea that you're willing to take a risk or suffer some kind of pain early in a transaction on the assumption that you will gain benefits that will slowly accrue over time after that initial period of pain and compromise. Think of it as similar to getting a shot at the doctor. You go to get some kind of immunization and you have to get a shot, and there's initial period of pain and discomfort when the shot is administered, but you're willing to put up with that pain because that pain represents the delivery of a medicine that's going to protect you again and again and again for a certain amount of time into the future. And so you're willing to accept that intense discomfort initially so that you can enjoy the diffuse benefits of that medicine over a longer period of time into the future. Because multilateralism is a dominant theoretical perspective in international politics, it has some of its own jargon and key terms that you should be familiar with in order to understand some of the scholarship and policy literature written about it. The first are a set of acronyms that you'll see pop up quite often. The first one is the IGO, or Intergovernmental Organization. This is an organization that is comprised of states, sovereign states, as their members. And you're familiar already with plenty of examples of these. The United Nations is an IGO. Its membership are sovereign states. If you are not a state, you cannot be a member of it. NATO is an IGO. It is an organization made up of sovereign states. The OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, is another example of an IGO, and we'll talk about these organizations in a moment here. Another term, the NGO, the non-governmental organization. As you can probably logically deduce from the title, this is an organization or group that is not a state, but has some kind of influence and power in its activities. And it's obviously an organization that operates at the transnational level, usually in the form of pressuring, of lobbying, of raising awareness, publishing information, and other types of activities that these types of groups engage in. So, for example, Amnesty International is an NGO that deals with political prisoners around the world. Greenpeace is an NGO that deals with environmental issues around the world. The Union of Atomic Scientists deals with issues of nuclear proliferation. And a lot of these have sort of a progressive bent to them, but notice terrorists are also an example of an NGO. They're a non-governmental organization that have specific political objectives and that are obviously not states. Where we may think of ISIS or wherever the fate of ISIS is, it's not a state, hasn't been recognized as a state, even if it controls territory for a period of time. And so it's better understood as an NGO. And finally, we have the TNC, the Transnational Corporation. These are for-profit organizations, businesses essentially, that operate at the transnational level, operate in many countries simultaneously for the purposes of generating revenue, making money basically. So McDonald's is around the world, restaurants in pretty much every country. Fiat is a car manufacturer that owns Chrysler, has operations in all parts of the world, build cars in multiple countries, sell cars in multiple countries. Deutsche Bank is a bank out of Germany. It collects deposits and funds from around the world and then reinvests them in other countries around the world. It may be headquartered in Germany, but its operations are global. In addition to these organizations, there are several other concepts that are important to know. The first of these is the norm. Norm is a single rule that most states recognize as being in force and voluntarily obey them. Notice that, as we've discussed, there's no international police force, there's no international global authority that can enforce these norms and rules. They are obeyed by the states in the name of facilitating cooperation and efficiency. So one example of a norm is territorial integrity, the idea that a state is entitled to rule its own territory without outside interference. Another one is diplomatic immunity, the idea that a active serving diplomat in another country is not bound to the laws of that country. The diplomats sort of have the ability to operate without being arrested, without being prosecuted by the local law enforcement officials. And of course, the idea here is that you grant that immunity to a diplomat in your country so that your diplomat is not held to the local laws in another country. You're willing to give something up here, give up a certain amount of the ability to arrest or to prosecute a foreign diplomat so that your diplomat is not subject to the laws of another country. A regime we've talked about a little bit already. This is a cluster of rules and regulations. We've discussed them within the context of arms limitation treaties. And you can see why these are regimes, because they're clusters of treaties, they're clusters of rules, they're clusters of regulations that, again, are adhered to voluntarily by the nations that draft them and adopt them. So the arms limitation regimes, which we talked about in previous modules, are an example. The non-proliferation, weapons of mass destruction non-proliferation treaties are an example of a regime. An institution is a formal brick and mortar organization that is the closest we get to any kind of formal state government at the transnational level. Again, institutions usually have some kind of physical manifestation. So NATO is an example of an international institution. It's a set of rules, it's a treaty, it's a set of norms, but it also has a physical presence, a physical existence. You can actually go to NATO and go into a building, and the people who work there are part of NATO. You can't do that with the arms limitation regime or diplomatic immunity. The World Bank is another institution that deals with international finance. The World Trade Organization obviously deals with trade. International Law of the Sea deals with regulating laws outside of sovereign territory on the oceans. These are all examples of institutions. When you put all these things together, norms, regimes, and institutions, you get something called governance. Now, governance should not be confused with government. Governance refers to informal and non-binding ruling apparatus. States are not obligated to follow any aspect or adhere to any aspect of governance, but again, as we've talked about, usually they do. Usually they themselves are the author of this governance. And it becomes, when you get enough of these institutions and regimes set up, it does become kind of like a web of governance that the state really can't get out of, can't escape from. It's not that they're trapped in the governance, it's just that the governance becomes so internalized within the foreign policy making capability that states see it essentially as in their own interest to adhere to all these various regulations. So we talk about security institutions and security governance. We tend to see two different types of communities or institutions, the pluralistic and cooperative security communities. We talked about the cooperative security community a little bit with NATO, and we'll talk a bit more about NATO here in a moment. But what we're trying to identify here conceptually are these groups of states that have formed what we call a community of practice, that they all, again, see themselves as having similar security interests and goals, and have agreed on the methods by which they will pursue those security goals and objectives. And part of this is obviously the idea that violent conflict is not acceptable. It's not necessarily giving up war as a tool of foreign policy, because many of these states have no problem going to war with states outside of the community. But notice that that's the key aspect to this. They are willing to go to war outside of the community, but they will not go to war to a member inside the community. They have what's called a cognitive understanding of what is and is not a threat. And they recognize their fellow community members as not being existential threats. So again, NATO. No member of NATO sees, I'll come back to that. No member of NATO sees another member as an existential threat. I hesitated there because Greece and Turkey might be an exception. At least they have been in the past. But at least right now, we don't see in NATO states eager to start conflicts with other members. They may be perfectly willing to pursue a rivalry outside of NATO, but within NATO, more or less, there is no real security rivalries. They cognitively understand that fellow security members, community members, are not threats. Now, again, outside, it's a different story. But notice that even here, a state that wishes to join a community can have their status change from a potential threat to a non-threat, but in order for that to happen, the state that's outside the community has to socialize itself into the norms and values and beliefs and principles of that community. And think about, again, NATO expansion and states that want to join NATO. This is not something that usually happens overnight. It takes time to join NATO. You have to understand what NATO's values are and demonstrate that you, as a state, will change your foreign policy to match those values. And if you're not willing to do that, you won't be admitted. And even if you are willing to do that, sometimes that's not good enough. Again, think about Georgia, think about Ukraine, who probably wish to join NATO, but because of the larger geopolitical situation, probably won't be allowed to. So again, NATO's an IGO, as we've hopefully figured this out by now. It has several key values that all of its members must adhere to, such as nonviolent conflict resolution among its members, human rights protection among its members, democracy among its members. And in terms of military policy, it devotes itself to integration and transparency. We'll talk more about integration in a moment, but again, suffice to say that you see a lot of cooperation in terms of military practice, military preparedness exercises, in terms of sharing and exchange of military personnel, of cooperative commands and cooperative training. All aspects of military policy in NATO are usually done under the auspices of a joint and collective operating procedure. If you go to any NATO headquarters in Europe, you will find members of every single NATO member at that headquarters, serving in some capacity. Of course, this raises the question that even though all the members of NATO are institutionally equal, would NATO exist without its primary members? And obviously the most primary of members in this case is the United States, offering what might be called hegemonic leadership. If the United States leaves NATO, and the current president has at times suggested that might be a possibility, would NATO cease to exist, or could NATO continue to exist as in its current form? Are the values that bind the NATO members together sufficiently strong to survive, for the institution to survive if the United States were to leave it? We don't know that question right now. It will be interesting to see in the future. One of the reasons why this is an interesting question is because NATO's actual command structure and its constitutional framework place the United States at a leading and dominant role in the institution itself. For example, the top military commander of NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander, by the rules of NATO itself, must always be an American. Um, the other part of that is that the civilian leader of NATO is almost always a European. So right now, the civilian leader of NATO, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, is Danish. The Supreme Allied Commander of NATO right now, however, is obviously an American general. Again, why is this the case? Because the bulk of NATO's military muscle is American. And so there's an acknowledgement on the part of NATO's members that because the United States plays such a central role in the organization, its leadership should primarily be American. At least the leading officer, the supreme officer, should be American. That doesn't mean that American soldiers don't take orders from other countries' officers when they're in practice or when they're in exercises or whatever. But ultimately, ultimate authority will always be with an American Supreme Allied Commander. Another security organization that is very visible in today's world is the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is a non-military organization, so it doesn't have any kind of military capacity that supervises. It's primarily a deliberative body. It's where diplomats and leading security and intelligence and military thinkers come together to hold conferences, to have discussions, to publish information, to consult with each other, and this sort of thing. OSCE has a very broad membership. Here we're talking about the standard NATO countries, but also countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, countries that are obviously not part of NATO and not necessarily part of the traditional Western alliance. But I mean, and this is important because this allows Western European and American and Russian security leaders to be able to have face-to-face time and talk about things, even if relations outside of the organization are quite frosty, as they are now. It's not just Europe that has security organizations. We can look at ASEAN and observe that this is a fairly effective, again, non-military organization that exists in Southeast Asia. This group is comprised of the various nations you see pictured in the slide here. Notice that ASEAN doesn't have a dominant hegemonic member like NATO does. It exists largely to balance the power of China. That if you look at all the countries that are members of ASEAN, that they all more or less have a relationship with China that could best be described as a rivalry. None of these countries are exactly allies or are close friends with China. And so you see here a sort of raison d'etre for the existence of ASEAN. But in the future, this may wind up being the foundation upon which a more closer cooperative security arrangement eventually takes hold. Integration, ultimate goal is to take disparate security policies of different states and sort of create them and combine them together until they become almost a cohesive one, a cohesive whole. And at that point, you're talking about not just integrating security apparatus, but integrating perhaps the states themselves, so that you're not talking about international security at this point. You're talking about a security policy that is integrated and no longer has the visible signs of international rivalry. Now, it's not surprising that we haven't seen total integration with any countries around the world. The closest we get to this is the European Union. And again, if you've been paying attention to European politics the last few years, you know that however close the Europeans were getting to a integrated security policy or an integrated constitution are largely falling by the wayside. And we'll explore that a little bit here in a moment. But before we discuss the problems with the EU, let's at least take a moment and marvel at the existence of the European Union, because it's nothing short of a miracle that the European Union exists today when you look at the long history of European states. You have centuries where these states have constantly been at war with each other, and you have endless death and destruction, millions of people killed as a result of the conflict that exists among European states. And here, all of a sudden, you manage to create an institution that succeeded at promoting peace and prosperity throughout its member states, to the point where they had integrated substantial amounts of their economies, their political systems, their societies. That's not an insignificant accomplishment. Why did this happen? Well, after World War II, obviously, there was a recognition that the status quo of balances of power, forming balances of power, having them collapse, wars taking place in the wake of those collapses, and as these wars become more deadly and devastating, the future of the continent and the states who exist in this part of the world was very much in doubt. And so there was an effort by people like Jean Monnet who said, we need to find a way of we need to stop killing each other, basically. We need to find a way to stop these conflicts from happening. And we need to create an institution that somehow allows states to operate in a closer relationship. And more importantly, we need to create an identity among Europeans themselves and have them start thinking themselves as European citizens, and not merely Germans or French or Belgian or Portuguese or whatever. And so in the wake of World War II, these ideas were put into practice, and the European was the result of that. The European Union, of course, did not form overnight. It took several decades of incremental change and construction. The first key moment came in 1951 with the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community. This looks rather mundane, but when you think about it, what are the two things you need in order to build a military? You need steel for your tanks and your guns and your bayonets, and you need power to power the factories to build all that stuff. And in Europe, for much of the industrial age, power came from the mining and burning of coal. So it's not surprising then that the Europeans would first integrate their coal and steel communities, essentially allow each state to observe and cooperate in the creation and manufacturing of military weapons, in the production of steel to make those military weapons, and in the mining and distribution of coal to power the factories that made steel and other basic commodities. As the 1950s proceeded, we eventually see an integration of atomic policy through Euratom, and also the first steps in economic integration with the founding of the European Economic Community. Another important step came in 1992, perhaps a dubious step looking back, the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, which created the single currency. And it was all in the wake of Maastricht Treaty, it was more or less full steam ahead towards full integration until 2004, when the attempt to draft a European constitution that would be the first step towards perhaps creating a European state stalled and ultimately failed in 2004. Part of the reason why the integration process stalled was on the question of security. There was a sense that if the European Union was going to someday be a European superstate, it would need its own defense policy and its own military capacity. It couldn't have NATO be its army and its navy and its armed forces. Obviously, because as we've just seen, the American military was the dominant military within NATO. So if there was going to be a true European state with its own military, it had to, at some point, either kick the Americans and the Canadians out of NATO or establish its own security apparatus. And there was a great deal of reluctance to do that. That means the Europeans would have to pay for their own security. They couldn't rely on the Americans to provide security for them as they have been doing for the last few decades. There's also the risk that you would see the recreation of balances of power if you got rid of NATO. You would see dominant states like Germany, France, and the UK attempt to dominate a nascent European military apparatus. As we move into the more contemporary period, we see other places where the European Union wasn't able to cooperate effectively. The refugee crisis in 2015 was very much indicative of this inability to cooperate, because we saw some states that want to create quotas and policies by which refugees could enter the European Union and could begin a process of integration. This was primarily Germany's policy. And you had many other European states that didn't want anything to do with the refugees. They wanted to keep them out, and if they were to let them in, it was only so they could transit to somewhere else. And so this was a huge disagreement among European states during the crisis in 2015. And it's a problem they haven't solved. They're still at odds over this. Of course, one of the biggest factors in the stalling of EU integration was the fact you had local populism in certain countries, especially Great Britain and France, threatened the project of the European Union altogether in the form of states withdrawing from the European Union. We saw this actually happen with the Brexit in the United Kingdom, where the popular referendum resulted in the pledge by the UK government to leave the European Union at some point. They haven't done it yet. They're not sure how they're going to do it, but at least according to the referendum, the people want the UK to leave. The leaders of Great Britain have pledged to leave, and now it's simply a question of how do you negotiate the Brexit, and they haven't really figured that out yet. Questions of negotiation between states are very interesting, and we're going to hit on that here in just a moment. But a few final questions and thoughts to wrap up this part of the lecture. When is cooperative and integrated security approaches effective? Does it only work when we see the states homogenous, like we tend to see in Europe for the most part? Or can they work in other parts of the world where there's less homogeneity, both between states and within states as well? Can the success or limited success of a European Union provide a model that can be emulated at a much broader global level, to the point where we might have some kind of global security integration take place in the future, something that would be deeper and more effective than just what we have now with the UN Security Council? And there's also the question of, is any integration or cooperation plausible without a dominant state to sort of take a leadership position? And this gets us back to the question of American leadership in NATO. Is NATO dependent on American dominance and American hegemony and American leadership? And if it is, then what's the chance of new security institutions taking place in the absence of that hegemonic leadership? Let's move on to other ways that states can solve conflicts without resorting to war or violence, and not necessarily within the purview of institutions or organizations, as we just discussed. Here we're talking about basically 4 possible activities: negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and adjudication. We're going to focus on these top 2, negotiation, mediation, in a moment. Just to round out the slide here, arbitration is when you have a third party come in and sort of serve as a neutral observer and actor in a dispute between 2 parties. The 2 parties in dispute can't solve the problems on their own, so you have a third person come in and act as a kind of mediator. It doesn't necessarily have a judgmental capacity, but can sort of provide a neutral ground and serve as a referee, if you will, in a negotiation between two actors. The fourth activity, adjudication, is similar, only this time you are having that third party act as a judge, that the two sides cannot come to an agreement, and rather than come to blows, allow a third party to make the decision over who is right and how the conflict should be solved. But let's focus on the first two for the rest of the lecture here, negotiation and mediation. So negotiation is something that happens quite often. And it obviously doesn't have to be just about security, but we're going to talk about negotiation in the context of a security conflict. And that basically means that on the one hand, negotiation can be a nonviolent choice in a dispute between two states, or it can be a way of solving an already existing violent dispute between two states. And so negotiation becomes very important, and how to do negotiation and when it's effective and when it isn't is a very important set of skills and understandings to gain. Now, there's been endless literature on negotiation between states and negotiation within the context of a security conflict. And we don't have the time here to go into all of that. So I'm going to focus on just a few key concepts here. One of those is the notion of, or the idea of the BATNA, the acronym BATNA, which stands for Better Alternative to Negotiated Settlement. And the idea here is that whenever a state can get a BATNA, which means that something that they want can be achieved without entering a negotiation, the negotiation is doomed to fail. And so there's a sense here that you need to incentivize states in a way that they see their interests, or they see the ultimate goal of their policies to be something that can only be achieved by going through a negotiation. Again, think of this in terms of an active conflict where both states want an end to the conflict, that they have both decided or have both come to the conclusion that neither one can win the conflict, that neither one can win the war. And so there's no better alternative to some kind of negotiated conflict because they have both concluded they can't win the war. And that's when negotiation can be its most effective. So the question becomes here, how do you avoid this BATNA? And there's several ways of doing this. One is to encourage goals that might not be the original goals of the state or states in conflict. Especially if you're talking about states who are in intractable conflict. Encourage them to see the ultimate solution to their conflict as not being a military solution, but only a solution that can be pursued through negotiation. And that way they'll be more willing to make concessions because they realize their ultimate goal can't be achieved. Other ways of doing this are changing the timelines, and this goes back to the concept of diffuse reciprocity, encouraging states to perhaps take what appears to be a raw deal, a deal that's not in their interest initially, but that will slowly turn into something that's beneficial to them in the long run. When you can sort of play with time this way, you might be able to encourage states to make concessions and ultimately try to come to the negotiation table to solve their problems. And even before the negotiation begins, if you can anticipate what the end game is and how you can deliver an agreement that's satisfactory to both sides, if you know this ahead of time before the negotiation begins, you can begin to set up a list of incentives and sanctions that will effectively encourage the belligerents, the states in conflict, to accept whatever negotiated settlement they wind up accepting. Oftentimes, the baton is avoided as a result of external events. If you recall, in previous modules, we talked about arms limitation and arms control regimes. Those came about in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both the Soviet Union and the United States realized there was really no alternative to coming to some kind of agreement to arms control. That if they couldn't come to an agreement and limit nuclear arms, that the alternative would have been nuclear war, something they both didn't want. And so the BATNA came about, or it was eliminated, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because they realized there was no better alternative, or there actually was a better alternative to nuclear war. But we should avoid the trap of seeing negotiation as something that's only done by states who aren't interested in using it for selfish purposes. We should avoid seeing negotiation as somehow morally superior to other forms of solving conflicts. Negotiation can be a way of exercising power. And, if you pay attention to the presidential campaign of Donald Trump, this is what he's talking about. Negotiation is a way of asserting power over your opponent and ultimately dominating them. And you don't need Donald Trump to understand this. You can go back to Nazi Germany and the way that Hitler used conferences and negotiations with other European states as a way of expanding German power in the 1930s, all the way up to the Munich Agreement. Generally speaking, states will not grant concessions that are contrary to their national interests. And if you are, in fact, a larger, more powerful state, you can use negotiation to realize those national interests against smaller states that realize they can't win on the battlefield and are willing to be humiliated at the negotiating table because, again, it's the better alternative to whatever would happen to them in an open conflict. But negotiation is very tricky. And one thing you have to be aware of when you engage in negotiation, especially at the international level, is the presence of a two-level game. This basically refers to the idea that while you are negotiating an agreement with a state on a set of issues, usually security issues for our purposes, there's also the problem of having to negotiate those same terms with your local constituency. So a good example of this was Bill Clinton in the 1990s negotiating the creation of the International Criminal Court with other states in the international community, and believing and agreeing to the existence and creation of this court that would prosecute individuals for war crimes if they were brought before the court, and then having to get Senate approval for the ICC in order for the United States to actually be part of this regime. And of course, if you know anything about this, Bill Clinton wasn't able to get this approval. And ultimately, he left office, and George W. Bush came into office and abandoned the whole project. Of course, the International Criminal Court still was created, it still exists, it's still operating, but the United States is not a party to it. And here this is an example of the two-level game ultimately failing, that Clinton couldn't successfully negotiate at both levels. He succeeded at the international level, but failed to negotiate successfully at the local level, at the level of Congress. This is an important question when we talk about climate change treaties. For a long time, the United States couldn't credibly negotiate a climate change treaty because whatever the agreements they came to, they weren't going to be endorsed by Congress, which is comprised of many members who don't believe climate change is an issue. With the Paris Treaty, that shows some signs of not necessarily being the case. Although, again, with the election of Donald Trump, he's threatened to withdraw from the treaty, and it may very well be the case that the United States won't be a party to that. And there's also the question of culture. And by culture, we mean the different ways that countries and regions of the world approach negotiation. And one has to be very aware of this in order for negotiations to succeed. The best way of thinking about this is to make the distinction between a low context culture of negotiation and a high context culture of negotiation. In the low context culture, negotiations are very direct. They cut to the chase. They are basically wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Sit down, let's talk about it, let's come to an agreement, let's get out of here before, the day ends. This is, in many ways, the Western approach to negotiations. There's very little fluff, very little fanfare and protocol. Again, you sit down, you hash out the disagreement, you come to a conclusion if it's possible, and you go your separate ways. In the high context culture, which is largely associated with Asia and some Eastern regions, this sort of approach is not conducive to successful negotiations. In Asia especially, when you negotiate with the Chinese or some of the Southeast Asian nations, the expectation is that the negotiations will take a long time, that there'll be a lot of preliminary meetings and a lot of protocol, there'll be a lot of ceremony involved. There'll be lots of dinners, lots of drinks, lots of informal discussions outside of the context of the negotiating room. And if you don't play these protocol games effectively, you're not going to be successful because a lot of the breakthroughs are not made right at the negotiating table. They're made at these various informal activities. And so it's important to know what the culture and the context of your negotiation is if you're going to be successful. The last thing we want to talk about here is mediation. Mediation occurs when two parties are unable or unwilling to end the conflict on their own, so they call in a third party to serve as a mediator between the two. This third party can be a third state, it can be and often is an IGO like the United Nations, or it can be an NGO that's seen as neutral and trusted by the states. When we think of successful mediation, probably the example that comes to many minds is the Camp David Accords. Here you have a third state acting as a trusted neutral mediator between two states that are in intractable conflict. And in the case of the Camp David Accords, you have the United States acting as a mediator between the United States and Egypt. These two states had been at war with each other for several decades prior to this, but both states trusted the United States to be a good faith arbiter between the two. So they were able to travel to Camp David, travel to the United States. They were able to come to the table to talk, to make concessions, to trust each other, because usually the United States would act as a guarantor of each side's promises. And as a result, you have a successful treaty that was concluded between Israel and Egypt that still holds today. Israel and Egypt are not in a state of war with each other, as many other Arab states are. And this has proven to be a very important development in the contemporary politics of the Middle East. And it wouldn't have been possible if Jimmy Carter in the United States hadn't served as a mediator in this conflict. Mediation comes about because the two states find themselves in what's called a hurtful stalemate. The consequences of the status quo are intolerable to both sides. Unfortunately, they don't know how to escape the status quo. They don't trust each other. They aren't willing to allow themselves to be the slightest bit vulnerable to their hated rival. So again, the third party comes in and can act as a guarantor, can back up the promises, make guarantees on the commitments of the other actor involved. And this goes a long way to having both sides in the conflict reach usually a very tentative and shallow, but ultimately binding agreement between them that can lead to greater and deeper agreements once the feedback loop kicks in. If we look at certain conflicts today, we can see and assess whether mediation might be helpful with these conflicts. The first of these is Israel-Palestine, where the two parties have been locked in the deepest of intractable conflicts for several decades. During this time, the U.S. has been seen as a viable intermediary, a credible intermediary trusted by both sides. Even though the United States and Israel have a very close relationship, especially in terms of security and defense, the Palestinians still trust the United States to be an honest broker in any future negotiations, although obviously there's not a lot of negotiations going on these days. Part of the reason why this is the case is because it's believed the United States does exercise some control over Israel, that Israel can't be as belligerent and as obstreperous with the United States as it can be with other states in the region. The United States exercises some limiting capability with regards to Israel. So for at least in the past, this was a reason why the United States was a trusted mediator in this conflict. Unfortunately, both sides right now don't seem to be interested in negotiating much of anything, and so whether the U.S. is a good mediator in this conflict is a moot point until both sides decide to come back to the negotiating table. But if you're to look at the Ukraine and Russia, could there be a viable mediator in this possible conflict? It's doubtful the U.S., especially given the accusations towards Russia and Russian interference in the election that are out there, it's doubtful the United States could be a mediator here. But is there some other possible organization or actor that could be a mediator? Could the EU be a possible mediator in this conflict? Could the UN Security Council be a mediator in this conflict? Could a non-state actor like, Jimmy Carter, who, again, as president, successfully brought Egypt and Israel together, be an emissary or an envoy that could act as a mediator? We don't know. And we probably won't know for some time, as again, this conflict looks both intractable and both sides don't appear to be interested in any kind of mediation at this point.